War. Get the time on here.
Put the date down.
Yeah. Okay. No, start out by the great. You see, you remember a great grandfather?
Yes, I had
On whose side?
my mother's name was Troxel, her maiden name, and she had as her mother name was Parr. That would be my grandmother's Parr, and she had married a Troxel. Now, my grandmother's father, who was John Parr, who was my great grandfather, was someone that I can recall. I can even recall the day he died. He died on Thanksgiving Day in 1929, when I was 11 years old. He lived in the little town of Argenta, Illinois, and I recall as a boy going and visiting with him, my grandpa Parr, and he told me about fighting in the Civil War. He had come from Ohio. He lived in Wapakoneta, Ohio, and he'd come out of Ohio after the war. I'll take that back. He left before the war. He went in the volunteers in the Civil War from Illinois. He fought with an Illinois group. In those days, in the Civil War, the states and cities all fought in the same army. And he told me about fighting and going down into Tennessee and fighting at the Battle of the Lookout Mountain. And then he was a carpenter, and he built houses in Argenta way back. And I remember him.
How old was he when he died?
He was 90. He was that was in 1928, so that made him being born in 62 years before the 1900s, so that would make him born in 1838. He was born in 1838. He lived to 1928.
What? He just lived in Illinois?
I'm sorry, 1929.
Just lived in Illinois?
No, as I said, he was born and raised in Ohio, Wapakoneta, Ohio. And then they went from there, they moved west in those days by, as I recall my mother telling me, they moved there by wagon to Argenta, Illinois, which was outside of Decatur. I can also
How many children did he have?
He had 9. He had 4 boys and 5. He had 10. He had 4 boys and 6 girls. 6 daughters.
How about his wife?
His wife's name was Jackson, Ellen Jackson. Did
you ever see her?
Yes. She lived. She died before he did, but maybe by 3 or 4 years. I remember seeing her in my mind. I can think how she looked. She looked like a pioneer woman, and she was from Ohio too. Where, I don't know. She had also come to Illinois. Then I had my mother's father. His name was Troxel. My grandfather Troxel, I remember very well. He died in 1939. He had been born in 1867, and he died in 1939. Again, he lived in Argenta, lived around there all of his life. His father was a Civil War veteran, Jim Troxel, but I never did. He had died years before I come around. His wife's name, Jim Troxel's wife's name was Jones, so that's another name.
Don't get me confused. You're talking about
my great-grandfather Troxel, Jim Troxel. who I didn't ever meet.
That was your mother's
My mother's grandfather.
grandfather.
She had two grandfathers.
The Parr was your mother's
grandfather also. See, that was her maternal grandfather.
How about your dad's side? Was there anybody there that you ever saw?
Oh, I saw my grandfather.
But no great parents.
No, but the names might be interesting to someone. He married my grandmother, who died when my dad was only 5 years old. Her name was Brandstetter. Interestingly, her uncle had worked with Wyatt Earp, and he come to Illinois. He died in Illinois. I met him, Duke Brandstetter, and I remember one time he told me a little bit about the old Wild West, but he must have died sometime in the early 30s. And then my grandfather Troxel's, or my grandfather Rinehart's father's name was George Rinehart, and he had married a Matlock. George Rinehart had come from Virginia through Ohio in a wagon, and a number of his brothers. He was, as I understood it, he was from a family of 8, 9 brothers, and all of them stopped in Ohio except him, and he went on to St. James, Missouri, and that's where he lived. And he was a very well sharp guy too, because he had sons that were a lawyer, state representative, and so forth. And my grandfather, well, and that family, that's my father's family, and that's all I know. The different names in that family were Brandstetter and Matlock.
Do you know how old your great-grandfather Rinehart was?
Do not know.
How about your grandfather Rinehart?
Yes, he died when he was 72, and he died while I was in the war. Must have been about 1941, 42, somewhere. My grandmother Troxel also died. In fact, that had to do with my meeting your grandmother, whoever I'm talking to, Faye. I was home to my grandmother's funeral, and I met my wife, Faye.
So you had your grandfather Rinehart died at 72. Your grandfather, the two grandfathers on.
You're trying to make longevity?
Well, I'm trying to get a little.
They all died in 70s. Okay. All of them were. My grandfather Troxel was 72. My grandfather Rinehart was 72.
Okay, how about your grandfather Rinehart? How many?
My grandmother Troxel was only 66.
How many children did grandfather Rinehart have?
Well, he only had my dad by the wife that died, and he had a daughter, my father's sister, who died when she was 5 years old. She died about the same time that my grandmother died.
Okay, how about on your mother's side, Troxel?
Well, there were 6 kids. There were 3 boys and 3 girls. My mother was the oldest, and there was 6. There was 3 boys and 3 girls.
Where they live at, Troxel?
Well, Charlie Troxel's still living at 94, and he lives in Macon, Illinois. He worked on the railroad, and then worked for the post office. And Bonnie Troxel Pittman lives in St. Louis, where her son Ray Jr. lives. And then Ruth Troxel died. She was a school teacher. She's been dead since 1979. And Herbert Troxel, who was my uncle and in some ways almost like a brother to me. His age difference, he was only 8 years difference than I. And he died in 1968, at 58 years old. And then Cecil Troxel died real early, 31 or 32. And then, of course, my mother was the 6th one. She died in 1978. the age of 85.
The Troxel, you say that he only, you didn't say he only lived in Illinois?
Yes.
Troxel only lived in Illinois.
My grandfather Troxel lived in Illinois all the way. Now, his family, you can go back to the Revolutionary War, which is interesting, in that his grandfather's name was Brian Troxel. And he was a school teacher in Illinois, and he married in like 1837. Yeah. And he married a Dickey. And Dickey that he married was a daughter to a Revolutionary War soldier, and he's the only Revolutionary War soldier buried in Illinois in Macon County. The only one buried at French Creek, and they have a little thing there. Anyway, that was my great grandfather, Dickey.
So the Troxels all lived in, always lived in just Illinois. All right, let's go to your parents. When did they meet?
Well, as I understood it, they met in 1912, first time. My dad was 19 years old, and he'd come to Argenta working as a farmhand, and they met, but that's all they could say. They were married anyway in 1916.
Well, tell a little bit about your dad when he, how he came across to Illinois or to.
Well, my dad never had, of course, any home. He lived in first one place, another, wherever they'd have him for the winter.
Why was
they
that?
did because his dad just didn't pay any attention to him, and his dad didn't had married, and he had some children, and I guess he just wasn't very welcome. So he lived with uncles and worked with them and so forth.
That's because his dad
had remarried.
His mother had died.
Well, yeah, as I told you before, right. She died when my dad was 5 years old. And then Dad went to Kansas to the wheat fields, starting when he was 16 years old. In the summertime, all by himself, go in the wheat fields, make some money, come back. He even taught school, and he, of course, didn't have a certificate or anything. He'd only gone through the 8th grade, but my dad was always pretty sharp, and he taught school. When one of his cousins, who was a school teacher, got sick, so my dad taught school. And then every winter he'd teach school for a while, whenever one of the teachers got sick. In those days, though, it wasn't much of to be a teacher, just somebody that would do it. You'd get paid a little bit. And Dad then started coming to Illinois in 1912. And then I guess he skipped a year and he came back in 14. Then in 16, he and Mom were married. My mother was a school teacher and had taught school since 1912.
How old was he when he met your mother?
When he got married, he was 16 plus 7 is 23.
And how old was your mother?
She was same age. They were only 2 months apart to the day.
She was, you didn't tell how they, because I heard Irish talk about how they met.
Well, yeah, that was something I really didn't know about. They had met, and I wouldn't really want to tell just how it happened, because Irish told it so well. And it's on a tape that I have, I think you have too. She, my mother tells a story that she decided she was going to marry Dad, wanted him for her husband, so he was so bashful he wouldn't do anything about it, so she went over and told him, Walter, we just been long enough, it's about time we got married. That's the way Mom tells it. Whatever it was a perfect marriage anyway, I know that.
And then your dad, what did he do for them? What kind of occupation did he have after?
Well, he was a farmhand. When I was a kid, when I was one of the first earliest things I can remember was standing up in a buggy that my dad let me hold the reins to a horse. I even remember the horse's name, Jim. And my dad, or my mother told me that I couldn't have been only about 2 years old at that time. For some reason I remember it. Or at least I think I do. You remember it and you tell about it and then you wonder if you really remembered it or not. But my brain says that I do. And he worked then as a farmhand, and then he moved into town after we'd lived in farm houses as hired hands, and lived in a little house or a room in the house. And my mom taught school. Well, no, not after I was born. She didn't teach school. She would work in a farmhouse too. And then Dad went into town, and my mother's uncle, uh, Ernest White, was a carpenter and a home builder around there. And so Dad took on learning as an apprentice the carpentry trade. And he did that. Then he got the opportunity. Dad was always active in churches, and the minister at the Methodist Church, why his son was a foreman of the carpenter gang, so-called, at the Staley Company in Decatur. So Dad was hired at Staley's as a carpenter, and that was in May of 1923. Then we moved to Decatur in September of 1923, August or September of 23. Another thing I remember in Argenta, when my dad car wouldn't start, where I crank up or jack up the Model T and crank it with a wheel, with the axle. But we then moved into Decatur on the corner of Oakland and Grand in 1923.
When did you get the job, Steve?
That May in 1923. I just said that.
And
he worked there until he retired in 1959, 36 years.
how about World War I? How did why did your dad was too old for World War I?
No. Dad, but Charlie had gone to the service. Dad was married,
Charlie
so
being
Charlie Troxel, my uncle, and my other uncle Cecil was had gone down to the training camp. My dad got drafted just about in November of 1917, or December, some such time as that. Or not 1917, I'm sorry. Dad got drafted in 1918, about 3 months before the war, so he was supposed to get drafted. And then he had not been drafted at first because he was working on the farm, and they were deferred, but then he got drafted, and then about the time he was supposed to go to camp, boy, he got the flu. And he had a severe flu, 1918 flu, and almost died. And then the war ended. So he didn't go. He would have gone if the war had gone on. But Charlie was over in France, and Cecil, his brother, did not get across. He was trained and went to Arkansas and almost died of the flu in the camp.
okay, then let's go. You say 19. That was
1918.
and you were born.
I was born in February 1918.
Okay, then who was next as far as births?
Ralph was born in 1920, January 26th. Alice was born January 26th, just 2 years to the day from Ralph in 1922, and Iris was born June the 10th, 1930.
How about when you guys were growing up? Did you fight a lot?
Fought just like any other brothers, I guess, would. We never had any severe fights. We fought guys that tried to fight one of us. We generally defended each other pretty well, but yes, we had fights.
Well, your mother always tells a story about some story about you sleeping in strawberries. I'd like to know about that.
Cherries.
Cherries, okay.
Yeah, well, I had we'd gone out to Argenta to grandfather's and got cherries. He had a lot of cherry trees. Picked a lot of cherries. Mom had made me quit eating cherries. So during the night, my sleep, when I was a kid, I used to do a lot of sleepwalking. I got up and got a bunch of cherries, and it was so that I thought I could eat them, and I put them in the bed and then got in the bed and went to sleep on cherries. I took care of the sheets. Why I did it, I don't know. But that was when I was in my teens.
About all your brothers and sisters graduated from high school.
Yes.
And then you went to college?
I started at college and didn't finish the semester. I had a scholarship deal from the Staley Company plus a scholarship for baseball at Millikan, and I went to, well, it didn't quite go a semester. Quit.
Well, there's a lot of difference between your age and your youngest sister by the time you were, how much difference in age?
12 years. When I went in the service, she was just a kid, 11 years old.
And your mother, the whole time that she only was a teacher prior to you getting, prior to her having kids, and she was a housewife.
In those days, they wouldn't let anybody teach that had kids. As soon as they got married, they had to quit teaching. It was teachers. It was very difficult for a woman to get a job, and it was very difficult for a woman teacher that got married to retain her job. They generally made them quit.
Okay, let's go back. When you were in school, did you do well in high school?
Well, I did well enough to get on the honor roll. Got a white letter for my sports because I was an honor roll student.
Okay, how about sports? You said you were in sports. What did you do?
Well, I played football in high school. I played with the reserves, and I got hurt last game of the season with a severe ligament injury on my ankle. And then I played basketball that year, and the next year I started in spring practice. Even in high school we had spring practice, and I hurt my ankle again, and the coach said that he would rather have me just play basketball. So I didn't play football my senior year. Played basketball. We won the state championship.
Well, how about your basketball team?
Well, we were good enough to win the state, but during the season, we had a terrible season. We won 14 and lost 10. Turned around and won the state championship, went all the way. We just found ourselves, we had a big boy, it was 6'5", and he started holding on to the ball and playing a little tougher, and our team gelled. I was not on the first team, though.
Well,
I didn't play very, very little.
Back
I
then,
played baseball, but we didn't have high school baseball.
Back then when you played basketball, what were some of the scores you had back then?
Well, to give you an idea, in the state tournament, that's when you go after you've won the sectional, regional, district, and all that, and you have a long way, because Illinois only had one tournament for all 1,000 high schools, or whatever it was. They had no Class A, B, C. And when we went to what was called a Sweet 16 at Champaign-Urbana at the Illinois Gymnasium, the first game we played Peoria Manual, and we won 14-10. The second game we played Hull, Hull, out of Quincy, and we won that one like big score, 29-20. The third game we played Johnson City on Saturday afternoon of the finals, and we beat them 18-17 on a basket by a boy, Dale Millink, who's now dead, and we won it 18-17. The basketball went through the basket as a gun sounded. And then in the final game, we beat Danville, Illinois, for the state championship. Danville had not lost a game that year in basketball or football, and we beat them 27-22 in the final game. So that gives you some idea. It wasn't unusual for a team to You get the ball and just stand back and pass back and forth and not even try to do anything.
Well, when you were going to high school, did you drive a car or a bicycle?
I drove a car from the time I was 13 years old. We didn't have to have a driver's license. But of course I didn't drive the car to school or even think about having it. The only kids I can remember having cars were the ones that lived on the other side of the track, and some of those did. But oh no, I had no car. I bought my first car when I got out of high school.
You walked to school then?
Oh yes, every day. Run. I used to run, go down the railroad tracks. It was about 2 miles.
3 foot of snow? Uphill?
No. There was snow, but no, we didn't have any. Naturally, there wasn't any way to go. You could ride the bus, but that cost a nickel. And if my mom would have given me a nickel, which she wouldn't, I'd have saved it anyway. I would have walked to school because that was better than spending a whole nickel.
How about girlfriends?
In high school, I didn't have any.
You didn't have any, didn't date at all?
Didn't date at all. I made up for it later.
All right, so then once you got out of high school, you went to Milliken, right?
No. My first year I worked at Staley's, and I didn't go to Milliken my first year. And I had this scholarship with Staley's and through Staley's, but I didn't utilize it, and I didn't go then until the next year, which was 1937.
And you played baseball with Staley?
Well, no, at that time I was playing at the Decatur Grays, which was the best semi-pro team around Central Illinois.
Who did they pay?
Who did they pay?
Semi-pro.
Well, they would pay the pitcher sometimes or the catcher. I never got paid with them, though. I did with a couple other ball clubs I played with. When I say I got paid, I got like $3. I used to go down to a little town named Bruce once in a while to play, and the pitcher that got $7, as much as $7 for pitching a game, and I got
Back on then. So you were talking about baseball when you were playing for Staley's. How about
I never played with Staley's in baseball, only
softball,
when
man?
yeah, I played with Staley's in baseball only as a fill-in. When one of their players was gone, I had a day off or something. I played 2 or 3 ball games at the penitentiary.
What about how about other relatives? Wasn't there some other relatives like the Troxels that played baseball?
None of them played anything but semi-pro baseball. Or I mean just played baseball. Wasn't necessarily semi-pro. They used to call it semi-pro then because generally the pitcher and the catcher get paid a little bit.
There was no other relatives that played any really
They
played
always played baseball. All the Troxels. Yep. But none of them played professionally.
So then when you got out of high school, then you went into started working for Staley's, right?
Yes, I worked there and worked at a service station. The Staley's wasn't very steady.
And then is that when you start dating other girls then when you're out of high school?
Boy, you're not kidding. I sure did.
So then when did you meet Mom?
I met her in 1942 in February when my grandmother died. Was home from Bearfield, Indiana on a short leave, and I met your mother.
Well, wait a minute, you were in the service by then.
Oh yes, I was in the service for over a year by the time I met your mother. I was
How long were you out of high school
corporal.
before you went into the service?
Well, I was out of high school in 1936. Didn't go into service until 1941, almost 5 years.
So then you got drafted or enlisted?
Enlisted in the Air Force.
And what, 1941 you were playing?
February the 4th, 1941.
That was prior to
Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor didn't come till December 7th, 1941.
They were drafting all the time then?
Yes, they were drafting.
The
Guys
draft?
supposedly were only in for a year. The draft.
They didn't, at that time though, there was no declaration of war didn't come until 41, till December. But there
After the Pearl Harbor, why then we declared war on Japan, but of course then we did not declare war on Germany at that time. We declared war on Japan on December the 8th, Monday, 1941, and the politicians, the president, was afraid to declare war on Germany because it would be too unpopular. Even though things had happened, people were very much against us entering the war and going to Europe. So then Hitler saved us the trouble because he declared war on the United States. So therefore we then declared war on Germany on December the 10th.
Okay, so you came back on leave. You say you came back on leave and you met Mom. How did that take place?
We met her at a dance.
Where at?
Well, at a dance downtown.
In Decatur.
Yes, in Decatur.
And that was when?
That was in February 1941.
That's just.
Well, the way you question me, you act like I committed a crime.
Well, no, I'm just asking you, trying to get you
I'm
to say.
kidding.
February 1941. How about that's when you went into service?
No, I said February of 1942. I met your mother after the war started.
Okay. After 1942, you met her. Then how long did you go together?
Well, we had about 15 dates. We had 10 dates when I was home on furlough and about 5 others, and then I went back went to California. And then we decided to get married. I proposed over the telephone in 1942 about June, and then I was able to secure a detached service duty in Indianapolis at Butler University. So I come back to Butler University in June of 1942 to take a 4 weeks course in Allison engine. At that time I was an airplane mechanic and I was an engine specialist. See, by then I was a staff sergeant. I made tech sergeant while I was at home on detached service, and I hitchhiked home on July the 10th of 1942 to, when I say home, to Decatur. And your mother and I went down to St. Louis the next day, July the 11th, and were married with a friend of mine, Norbert Anderson, who was a staff sergeant, I think. Maybe he was a tech sergeant at that time. I was a staff. And we came back then from St. Louis. And then after spending our wedding night, the next morning, your mother went with my father and mother in a car, and they took me out about 25 miles and put me on the road, and I hitchhiked back home. And then after that, after I finished school there, I came home. I got a trip to California, and they paid, since by that time I had made tech sergeant, they paid for my paid for your mother's trip also on a train. We come back by train. We got in California, we had $45 in cash and no place to live. And we come in on the train at Oakland. We got on the ferry and went across to the other side of the bay. We got a ride on a bus to, or no, we went in the Air Force station wagon, come out and picked us up and took us into San Rafael, and I got a hotel room for your mother and I to stay in one night. And well, in fact, I guess I stayed there every night. We were only there about 3 nights. And she went out and looked for an apartment, and we rented an apartment for $27.50 a month. And that was in July of 1942.
And then where'd you go from there? You went to
Well,
after.
from there, I've been accepted to go to Air Force officers training school in Miami. And I was then become an officer. I'd passed the necessary tests I took, and went before a board and was accepted. And about the time I was ready to go, why then they canceled and stopped all people going to the Air Force Administration School because they were bringing in Hollywood stars and so forth, and they weren't letting anybody like myself in. So the officer, my commanding officer, Major Stone, who was later killed in the war, convinced me that I should go to officers training school in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, in the field artillery. So your mother and I then went clear across country to Decatur, and then I proceeded to go down to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and then I resigned after I was there 2 or 3 weeks. I didn't want anything to do with field artillery. I'd been in the Air Force, and I had a hell of a time getting resigned. I had to go up to talk to a 1-star general, and he told me that they'd let me go, but that I'd go back to the Air Force and I'd be unassigned. He didn't want me to because my grades and everything was all right. He didn't see why I didn't want to be an officer in the field artillery, that I could make it and all that. I didn't want it, so he said, well, okay, you go back to the Air Force unassigned as a private. But I was then transferred back to Jefferson Barracks, but I did not lose my rank. I was transferred back as a tech sergeant. And then from there I went overseas. Well, your mother and I stayed down there for about 3 weeks. And
When did you go overseas?
Went overseas in January the 12th, 1943.
And then you went into where at in Africa?
Well, I started out, I was in Accra, British Gold Coast, Bathurst, Gambia, and then Dakar, Senegal for about a year, and then up the other 2 places, Bathurst and Accra. I was just there a short time, maybe 6 to 10 weeks, the 2 together. And then I went from Dakar to Casablanca, and I was stationed at Casablanca then until I was rotated back to the States in April of 1945, just before the war was ending in Europe.
So you came back in 1945.
April the 12th, 1945, I landed in New York the day President Roosevelt died.
So there wasn't exactly partying in the streets then at that time, was there?
No, sure wasn't. Now we went from there to Love Field in Dallas, Texas.
Well, when did the Germany surrender?
Germany surrendered May the 9th. The settlement was made, or whatever, the peace treaty was signed, and the war officially ended May the 9th, 1945. The war with Japan continued on till August the 14th. The Japanese surrendered, but then the final peace wasn't signed until September 2nd, 1945 on the Missouri battleship.
So you came home in 1945, and well, you want to hurry up?
Yes, I came home in 1945. And I went to work at the Staley Company in Decatur. That's where I'd been before when I went into the service. I went back to Staley's. I took a job on the 3rd shift at first, and then bid a job. I became active in the union, and I worked out a deal which the GIs then got to take advantage of their seniority and get jobs that were put up for a so-called bid while we were in the service. And I went into the Boilermakers as an apprentice Boilermaker. And Was in that about 10 months, 8 months, when I was offered a job with the union. Same time I was offered a job with the union, I was offered a job with the Staley Company in management in the standards department. But I decided to go to the union instead of going to Staley's, which I was happy that I did. And I went to the union, to work for the union in November of 1946. Yeah, Dennis and Butch had been born, Chuck was born, and while I was overseas, he was born July the 4th in 1943. And then Dennis was born in 1946 on February 22nd, Indicator, when we lived in East Olive Street. And then Keith was born in September 26th in 1947 when we lived at Locust Street. I was home, of course, both when Dennis and Keith was born, but I was, of course, not home when Butch was born. I was overseas.
Well, continue on your work history. Just go through what
I worked with the union then, and I had a couple heart attacks. In 1950, I had one in the middle of a negotiating session in Danville, Illinois. And I then spent some time in a hospital, then went to the Veterans Hospital for 30 days. I was in the Veterans Hospital in Dwight, Illinois. And then I went back to work with the union, and then in September of 1952, I had another heart attack, and then I left the union. I was without a job through September until the next February, when I was hired by a company in Danville, Illinois, called the F.L. Jacobs Company. I worked for them then as a personnel manager, labor relations director. Then I quit that company because they were on financial problems, and also they had told me some things that didn't happen, and I felt that the company wasn't a dependable company, and I didn't want to be a labor relations man for them because I didn't know when I was telling them the facts or something that was not true. So I left them and I went to work as a real estate salesman in 1954. Yeah, 1954, in October of 1954, I worked as a real estate salesman in Decatur, and then I secured a job in the following May with the Tecumseh Products as their personnel and labor relations director for their plant in Danville, Illinois, and Tecumseh Products. And then they sold that plant, and I was transferred to New Holstein, Wisconsin, where Tecumseh bought a plant, and I stayed with Tecumseh Products then as a personnel labor relations director until I took a job with Parsons Company in 1957 and went over to Traverse City, Michigan. I was there in 1957 until 1961 when I left Parsons, and left as I'd also the previous year had went into consulting business, and besides handling Parsons, handled some other accounts. And in 1961 February, I took a job as the Ohio Contractors Association Industrial Relations Manager, and I stayed there until 1976. In 1976, I went into business as a labor relations consultant and worked there until I got out of the business in 1981. That's my work history.
I don't know, I really don't have anything else. The only thing I was gonna ask you, that I went over, that I thought what I'd, back when you, first, I guess you guys must have first had cars. First car you had, no, it was your first car, but, when you drove from, how far was it from Decatur to St. Louis? You always tell that story. You drove from Decatur to
Well,
St.
it was
Louis. About
115 miles. That was the third car, or second car I had. The first car I had was a Model T Ford, which I bought for $7.50. As a 1923 Model T, that was in 1936, and I kept it for, I don't know, 6 weeks, a month, something like that. Traded it for a 1926 Willys Star, called what in the world did they call it? A Star, yeah, a Star. It was a Willys night product. And when I went to St. Louis, the story I tell was we went down to St. Louis. There was 5 of us going to the ball game to see the Cubs and the Cardinals play. And we took almost a day to get there. We had a lot of mechanical problems. One of the boys that went with us was our mechanic. His name was Barding, and all the Bardings were new cars inside out. And he went along as our chief mechanic. And we had all kinds of problems going down to St. Louis and coming back. Coming back, we had the points had to be replaced. And we put the points in the car, and we didn't put in a set screw to hold the points in place. The car run fine, and it hit a bump, and it stopped. So we eventually solved that by having a guy ride on the running board, and whenever the car stopped, he'd reach in and take the distributor cap off and adjust the points, stick it down, and then it'd run again. And we came all the way to about 30 miles before we finally stopped, or could stop at a place, and we got a set screw so we'd hold the points in place on the distributor. But that was a 2-day trip going to St. Louis, 150
you had
miles.
flat tires.
Not that time, and that's last year. The Model T, we drove to my grandfather's when I bought the Model T, which was 13 miles. Of course, the first place I wanted to go was show the car to my Grandpa Troxel. And hadn't done anything with the tires or inner tube. And on the way out to Argenta, 13 miles away, out and back, we had 5 flat tires. And always remember, we stopped at this one farmhouse and we borrowed a jack. And we took the jack back to the guy, and we went on down. The other places, the way we'd do, we'd run the car up on a rock or something, and we carried some concrete blocks or something. We'd get it up without a jack. When we come back from my grandfather's, well, we had a flat tire with this guy's house again. We went in to borrow the jack, and he said something like, "Son," he says, "I think if I were you, I'd borrow a jack if I was going to have that many flat tires." And that was on the Model T.
Isn't that the one you had the running board, or the floorboard, you could lift the floorboard up?
No, that was when I used to tell that about my sister. We used to go out in the Model T, and the first thing she'd have to do was go to the toilet. So as she sat in the back seat, we'd lift the floorboard up, and while we was running, she'd go to the toilet.
When you say lift the floorboard up, what do you mean just lift it?
Well, where you sit your feet, you can just reach down and lift the floorboard up. And if you didn't watch it, you fell through. That was a Model T.